Hello there, and welcome to your third lecture in Unit 5. 5.3, Classification of Biodiversity. So just a little bit of a review, right? Because this feels kind of like a jump. I want to make sure we're making the connections, right? In the last couple lectures, we've talked about how and why our living things have changed over time, right? The mechanisms that cause diversity, right? That's really what we're looking at this entire year. It's like these things that unify living things, right? So like energy and food and change over time and reaction, but also then the things that create diversity, right? Unity and diversity is really what we're focusing on this year in biology. Go like this. All right, so in this one, we're going to talk about, so now that we have all this diversity because of natural selection, how do we go about classifying animals, plants, and creating categories, right? Talking about how scientists over time have created categories to classify biodiversity. So in this lecture and the next lecture, we'll be looking at these things and then doing some practice in class on how to do them. Okay. All right. So the way that we classify, I also wanted to show you guys, I think I showed it in class, but I posted on, if you go to Classroom here, I put on the online book. So if you would like to, if you're not at home, or if you'd like to follow along with the book, you can always, so we're doing 5.3, and you can actually bring up the book here. So when I'm referencing the book or diagrams, you can actually see that. Okay, where's my lecture here? Nope. Aha. Okay. All right. So scientists use, there we go, binomial nomenclature. I love big words. But in this case, it's easy to kind of guess apart, right? So binomial, right? So two words. Nomenclature, so how we name things. And basically, as we go through and we look at like big to small, in the end, everything has those two names, right? As you can imagine, especially before, when I would say like mass communication, it's probably actually gotten worse, but like the scientists around the world, right, had ways of communicating with each other, but for the most part, were pretty secluded. So when they went about classifying animals, and then they all got together, you can imagine that there were some discrepancies on how we should group and separate and then name animals. So this is something that has changed over time. It's a really fun class I took called The History of Science in college. And it was all about like how these kind of fights came up between scientists and different ideas. But there was eventually like a congressional meeting of scientists, and they all agreed upon this simple system. That's in quotes for a reason. You'll see the simple system in a second. So it's simplistic in nature, but as you see the words and the different names kind of get overwhelming. But just know that you don't have to memorize those names, that it will be like, we'll be looking at graphs and charts and things like that. Okay. It says now we still fight, but about other things. But there is still disagreements when we find a new species, and there is an agreed upon, I like this, it feels like a fifth grade agreed upon, like pinky swear, whoever discovers the species gets to name it. That's what we're going to agree upon, right? And there is still this discovering, there's a huge push for like biodiversity right now and finding new species, right? And looking at places in rainforests and in the world, and even in around, like now that we have like the ability to look at very, very small living things, still discovering new species. All right, so this is still added, this is still existing, still trying to figure out how we classify all these things. Okay, you do need to know the three domains. So it starts out with these huge three domains. I want you to go ahead and pause the video and take a second to write down this chart. But then I put this over it because we're going to go over it in class. So this is blocked out. But go ahead and make like a chart that looks at the three domains. So the three domains that we have decided upon. And you can kind of go back to your bio roots of, you see like eukaryote here. We call it eukaryotic. And then the other word that you guys used was prokaryotic. But really the prokaryotic, the characteristics that we've kind of like memorized in biology are broken into two parts, so bacteria and the archaea. So we are going to separate those two and talk about the difference. And the features, the four features that you use to figure out which domain it goes into are these, right? So the histones, which we haven't talked about all these already, but just go ahead and write it down. We'll do it in class, right? So we have the histones, the presence of introns, the structure of the cell wall. Remember we talked about in eukaryotes versus prokaryotes, and then the cell membrane differences. So that's on a cellular level, how we go about doing those into the 3 domains. So make sure you have that chart in your notes, but just kind of keep it blank, because we're going to make some notes around it so that for this particular instance, like you know what introns are and histones when we're talking about proteins and the different types of cell membranes. All right, so 3 domains you need to know. Okay, and then after that, it goes through this super simple way of classifying organisms, right? And so the order in which, and we'll talk about some different ways you can remember it, but it goes from biggest, right, to smallest here. And then in this case, we're going smallest to biggest. So this is biggest to smallest: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, right? So the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Some mnemonic devices, like in 9th grade bio, I learned that kings play chess on fine grained sand. I still remember that. So that one stuck with me. Kings play chess on fine grained sand. I can somehow remember like these kings playing chess in the sand. I don't know why, but that visual worked for me. My teacher told that to me. Mrs. Gullick, she had on there is Kevin prefers coats on foggy gray Sundays, right? You know, Kevin, does that help you? But basically how it works is like the biggest incorporates everything below it, right? So if I go here, this is my kingdom, right? Then everything in this phylum is in this kingdom, and everything in the class is in the phylum, right? And so the species exists in all these different things, right? The species is in the same genus, family, order, like that. So it's kind of like this trickle effect. And I'll show you some other diagrams to help you kind of visualize that on the next slide. Okay, so kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. All right, so 4 different kingdoms that we have, right? And then I love when biology names like help you remember what they mean, right? There are some things that are just so like, oh my gosh, I just need to memorize this word. But in this case, it's kind of fun, right? There's the plant kingdom. There's the Animalia kingdom, there's the fungi, and then the Protocysta. We'll talk about a little bit more, and because that one's still under debate on like how we classify a protist versus a fungus, right? But basically, we'll look at bacteria, right? How bacteria kind of doesn't fit in the fungus and the mold one, but how do we classify a bacteria? Is still kind of up for debate. We're going to look at some examples. Again, you'll never have to memorize these, but you should need to know like the 4 kingdoms. And after that, it gets really diverse. So you've got plant, animals, fungus, and protist. Okay, let's look at some examples. So here's an example of all of those, actually 2 examples I put here because I added it, right? So if we're looking at the gorilla here, right? So this is the species, the genus, the family, the order, the class, the phylum, and the kingdom, right? So the domain is eukaryotes, that's not on there. The kingdom is the animal kingdom, right? The chordata, actually I have 2 here, right? Sorry, I was just looking at how I have these 2. So we have the gorilla, right? And then we have the red fox here. These are 2 examples. So this one is the red fox. So you can see that they are in the same kingdom, phylum, they're mammals, right? But this is where the order right here, this is where, right, it changed, right? Instead of being in the carnivora, it's in the primates. Okay, so you can see here when we're looking at 2 different, what I want to say, classifications, you can see where they like diverged evolutionarily, and we'll talk about that in a second. So the one that we usually go by right here, right, is the species, right? And sometimes they have the genus is the same species. Sometimes you'll see that double up. Okay, so that's one example of that. Let me go here. Sorry. And okay, I was just trying to get rid of those markings there. Okay, here's another example here, right? If you want to compare it to the last one, we have a tiger here, still in the animal kingdom, still in the chordata, still in the mammalia, still a carnivore, right? But then you see the feline, or that root there, change from, there we go, right? The canis, or the, you can think of like, oh gosh, dogs, right? The canis family, right? So here's another example. Again, nothing that you'll have to memorize, but you will have to know like the order and how things like fit within it. Okay. All right. So here's us. So currently we'll talk about kind of in class, like the debate on the common ancestor, but we are animal kingdom, male primates, and we are Homo sapiens, right? So that is our species is Homo sapiens, the two words that go together. Okay, I just saw this really fancy thing. Hold on. It says fireworks down here. Do you guys see this? This is a new one this year. What do we think is going to happen? Oh my gosh, look at that. Sorry, I'm talking to myself in a room, so I'm going to be excited about the fireworks there. Okay, all right, just one more. We have this tiny beetle here. I'm sorry, no, a roly-poly actually there. And so you can see like it's still in the animal kingdom, but this is an arthropod, right? A crustaceous. So you guys will see some things, isopod, that you probably will recognize, but again, not have to memorize. Okay, all right, so let's talk about the two different types of classification. One is natural classification, which is mostly what we use, and then we have unnatural classification. So these are the two being compared, okay? So natural classification, and there's a couple of paragraphs in this in your book. I just tried to summarize these pretty quick. So natural classification is when we look at species and we put them into the group based on the common ancestor, right? So based on the animal or the organism that it evolved from, their common ancestor, and we group those organisms together and then go through like that process, right? So then all the members of so when we look at a common ancestor, it all goes back to kind of like this branching tree. So all the members of a genus have a common ancestor. All the members of a family have a common ancestor, and so on and so forth. And what it looks like, there's an example in your book, but I'll show it right now. Here we go. What it ends up looking like, right, are trees that look a little bit like this, right? And so we have this common ancestor here. This is looking at ribosomal DNA, but when you look at those charts, they kind of look like these branching things. Like all of these, like this is the common ancestor, and then they broke off. So that all of these have the common ancestor. It's like everything before it. We'll look at some more examples. A lot of the ones that I've seen on test run books are kind of like this way. So they're not necessarily a tree, but you can actually follow the order of them kind of moving in a linear line, kind of like a timeline. Okay. All right. So going back here, the con of natural classification is that it's not always clear what the common ancestor is. So if that's what we're basing it off of, and we don't know what the common ancestor is, that creates problems. Okay. Unnatural classification, again, there's a couple paragraphs in your book, but the main points that you need to know about unnatural or artificial classification is that it's based on superficial traits. So an example, so not common ancestor. We're not looking at what it evolved from. We're looking at like, I would put birds, bats, and insects together because they have wings and they can fly, right? So it's a very superficial trait that I can see, but there is no common ancestor, right? This one's easier. This is the one that we mostly use, but you will, might need to know an example of an artificial classification. Okay. All right. There are still a lot of changes in classification because of technology. Right? We looked at a couple models in science, like your buckets, and we talked about how the models have changed over time because of technology, right? So what we thought was one thing, but now we have, microscopes, or now we have X-rays, or now we have the ability in this case to look at DNA. We're able to see the number of base pairs and how diverse those are, and able to create common ancestors used on DNA analysis, right? And so based on DNA and what we have learned from that and technology, previous classifications have errors, right? They've moved some things around. And the result of that is that there's been some changes in how we classify some animals. So for example, like the plants, the fungus, and the cell wall, like we use the cell wall to divide those two. And then the morphological observations versus the genetic analysis. So the morph is to change, right? So the things that we can see change over time, like in structures, and versus the genetic analysis. Sometimes those two things don't match up, and sometimes they change our classification. Okay. In class, we are going to look a little bit more. This is your theory of knowledge, deeper dive into how we come up with scientific consensus. Because as you can imagine, a bunch of really smart people in rooms like that, that's what they do for their living, this is their life is science. And you put them in a bunch of room and you say you have to agree on something when everyone has those like previous ideas of what happens, very much like your cartoon sequences, right? So everyone has this prior thoughts of what they think it should be, and then you have to get them into a room to agree on things, right? But whoever finds it gets to name it. My fifth grade Great thing. Okay, the last thing that we're going to do in class is look at dichotomous keys, right? Again, di, that root meaning two, and dicot to like cut, right? So we're looking at dichotomous keys. This is another way that we use to group mammals, and you guys are actually going to create one, but how we identify, I'm sorry, I think I said to identify mammals, to identify species by dividing things into two. And so who's ever creating this key design to create like some kind of grouping, they come up with descriptions that you can see and that like reliable, meaning like every animal has this, right? They're not like mutations or things that are kind of anomalies. So they're reliable and easily visible. This is the example in your book. So if I'm trying to classify this manatee, right, I would start with my first part of the dichotomy key. So fore and hind limbs are visible and can emerge on land, or only forelimbs and visible and cannot live on land, right? So very observable, very things that I can see in the picture, or I could look up. Maybe I'm like, I don't know if manatees can go on land. I can look that up, right? And so if we decide like that can emerge on land, then you go to 2 right here. If you, here, I'll add some fireworks, right? What does focus do? Oh my gosh. You guys, this is blowing my mind. I love this. I love all these new things they have. All right. And so if we go to 2 and then I say, okay, do they have paws or do they have flippers? If they have flippers, I go to 4. From the beginning one, if we decide they cannot live on land, right, you go to 6. And then you say, okay, things that cannot live on land, we're going to classify those into mouth breathers, or do they breathe through the blowholes, and so on and so forth. And when you get to one that doesn't have a number, that's how you classify it. So in this case, manatees cannot live on land, right? So I would go to 6 down here, and they are mouth breathing. There's not a blowhole like the whales have, and so this is my end result. Okay, all right. I think let's see, one more. Oh, I talked about this a little bit more, but the classification of humans. Controversy abounds, right? For a lot of different reasons, but are in the primate family. And then there's some, I guess, where the controversy exists outside of like the creation of life, is that looking like how we've changed over time, looking at how whether or not apes should be in that same family. So current research shows that chimpanzees and gorillas are more closely related to humans than orangutans. And so that's not how it used to be. We were originally put into that other family with the orangutans, right? There you go. Those are the 3 there. Oh, they're so cute. Oh, the baby. There it is. And so that has changed over time as well. Okay. You don't need to write that down. We'll talk about that. That's just kind of the summary of what I just said. So skip this one. Ooh. Here we go. Okay, so this is where we'll end for today. In class, we'll, again, look at dichotomous keys. We'll read through our theory of knowledge. Make sure you come with any questions that you might have, and have a great day.